They let me go after the audit, not realizing I knew where the skeletons were. The security guard handed me my personal belongings in a cardboard box and walked me to the lobby. 22 years of experience, 3 professional certifications, and a spotless record, all reduced to 15 minutes of awkward silence and a generic termination letter. I clutched the box tighter, knowing it contained more than just my coffee mug and desk photos. Hidden in my personal laptop bag was an encrypted drive that would soon make TechFlow Industries executives wish they'd never heard my name. My name is Nicole Martinez, and I'm 40 years old. 6 months ago, I thought I'd found my dream job as senior internal auditor at TechFlow Industries, a mid-sized technology consulting firm. The CEO, Robert Whitman, had hired me personally. We'd met through my cousin Elena at a family barbecue. Robert was her husband's college roommate. When he learned about my background in forensic accounting and risk management, he practically offered me the position on the spot. "Nicole, we need someone with your expertise," he'd said, his smile warm and genuine. "TechFlow is growing fast, and we need to make sure our financial controls keep pace." I was flattered. After 2 decades bouncing between larger corporations where I was just another employee number, the idea of working for someone who valued my skills felt refreshing. What I didn't realize then was exactly why Robert was so eager to bring in a family member for this particular role. From my first day, I threw myself into understanding every aspect of TechFlow's financial operations. The company had grown from 30 employees to over 200 in just 3 years, managing technology implementations for healthcare systems across the Southwest. Revenue had jumped from $12 million to $89 million annually, impressive growth that demanded equally rigorous financial oversight. I spent my first month mapping every process, from expense approvals to revenue recognition. I interviewed department heads, analyzed spending patterns, and created detailed flowcharts of our financial controls. While other employees saw me as the new audit lady who asked too many questions, I was actually documenting the intricate web that kept TechFlow profitable. Take our project management structure, for example. Each healthcare implementation required coordinating dozens of vendors, from software developers to hardware installers. I discovered that our project managers were handling an average of $2.3 million in vendor payments per quarter, yet the approval process was surprisingly informal. Most expenses under $50,000 went through with just one signature, usually Robert's. I also noticed something peculiar about our executive expense reports. While most companies I'd worked for had strict policies about business entertainment and travel, TechFlow's executive spending seemed remarkably high. Robert's monthly expenses alone averaged $47,000, nearly double what I'd seen at companies twice our size. When I mentioned this to Janet, our CFO, she waved it off. "Robert works incredibly hard, Nicole. He's earned those perks." But my forensic training had taught me to look deeper. I started tracking patterns. Robert's business dinners at high-end steakhouses occurred suspiciously often on weekends. His client entertainment expenses included charges at exclusive golf courses in locations where we had no active projects. His travel expenses showed first-class flights and luxury hotel suites for what were described as vendor meetings, yet I could find no corresponding contracts or business outcomes. The more I dug, the clearer the picture became. Robert wasn't just living well, he was systematically looting the company through inflated expense reports, fake vendor payments, and phantom consulting fees. I estimated the fraud at roughly $1.8 million over the past 18 months alone. What made this particularly egregious was how it was funded. TechFlow had recently completed a Series B funding round, raising $15 million from institutional investors based on our impressive revenue growth and lean operational structure. Those investors had specifically praised our disciplined expense management during due diligence presentations. They had no idea their capital was subsidizing Robert's lavish lifestyle. Even worse, I discovered that several upcoming projects were severely underfunded because money that should have been allocated to implementation costs had been diverted to cover Robert's fraudulent expenses. We were essentially stealing from future projects to pay for past fraud, an unsustainable cycle that would eventually collapse, probably taking down dozens of healthcare systems that depended on our implementations. But here's what really bothered me: despite being essential to uncovering this massive fraud, I was completely invisible to everyone except Robert. Other executives barely acknowledged my existence. During company meetings, my risk assessments were glossed over in favor of sales presentations and growth projections. When I raised concerns about our expense approval processes, I was told we'd address those operational details later. It was a familiar pattern from my previous jobs, the invisible expert whose work only mattered when something went wrong. I was the insurance policy everyone hoped they'd never need to use. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in March. I'd just finished compiling my quarterly audit report, which documented everything I'd discovered about Robert's expense fraud. The evidence was overwhelming: falsified receipts, payments to shell companies, personal purchases disguised as business expenses. I'd even identified specific bank account transfers that violated our fiduciary responsibilities to investors. I submitted the report through our standard internal process, expecting it would trigger an investigation by our board of directors. Instead, I was called into Robert's office that afternoon. "Nicole, we need to talk," Robert said, closing the door behind me. His expression was cold, nothing like the friendly demeanor I'd seen at family gatherings. "I've reviewed your audit report, and frankly, I'm disappointed." I was confused. Disappointed about what? "The findings are clearly documented." "The findings are wrong," he interrupted. "More than wrong, they're reckless accusations that could destroy this company's reputation." My stomach dropped. "Robert, I can show you the documentation. The expense reports, the bank transfers, the vendor payments that don't match any legitimate." "I don't want to hear it," he snapped. "You've been here 6 months, Nicole. 6 months. And you think you understand our business better than someone who built this company from nothing?" I tried to stay calm. "This isn't about understanding the business. This is about financial compliance. As a publicly funded company, we have legal obligations." "Don't lecture me about legal obligations," Robert's voice rose. "Your job is to support this company's growth, not to undermine it with paranoid conspiracy theories." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "These aren't conspiracy theories. I have bank records, receipts, vendor confirmations." "You have misinterpretations of legitimate business expenses," he said firmly. "And frankly, your attitude tells me you're not the right fit for TechFlow's culture." That's when it hit me. Robert hadn't hired me because of my expertise, he'd hired me because he thought our family connection would keep me quiet. He'd assumed I would look the other way, that I'd prioritize family loyalty over professional integrity. He'd completely misjudged both my character and my commitment to ethical standards. "Robert, I think you should reconsider." "I've already decided," he said, reaching for his phone. "Janet is preparing your termination paperwork. You'll receive 2 weeks severance and a positive reference letter, provided you sign a non-disclosure agreement about your time here." I was stunned. "You're firing me for doing my job?" "I'm firing you for failing to do your job," he replied coldly. "Your job was to help TechFlow succeed, not to create problems where none exist." Within an hour, I was walking to my car with a cardboard box and a head full of disbelief. 22 years of professional experience, and I'd never been fired for being too thorough. But I'd also never worked for someone who was systematically defrauding investors and clients. That evening, sitting in my kitchen, I stared at the encrypted backup drive I'd created of all my audit findings. Robert probably assumed I'd deleted everything and signed his NDA like a compliant family member. He had no idea that I'd followed standard forensic accounting practices from day one, including maintaining secure, encrypted backups of all sensitive findings. The next morning, I called my lawyer and began researching SEC whistleblower procedures. If Robert thought family loyalty trumped professional integrity, he was about to learn otherwise. The first sign that Robert's empire was crumbling came exactly 1 week after my termination. My former colleague Jennifer called me, her voice shaking. "Nicole, something terrible is happening here," she whispered. "The Riverside Medical project is falling apart, and nobody knows how to fix it." Riverside Medical was TechFlow's largest client, representing $12 million in annual revenue. I'd been managing the audit oversight for their implementation, ensuring that every dollar was properly allocated and documented. It was complex work that required understanding both healthcare compliance requirements and technology integration standards, expertise that takes years to develop. "What kind of problems?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Everything," Jennifer said. "The vendor payments are all mixed up. Nobody can find the contract documentation. The client is demanding financial reconciliations that nobody knows how to prepare. Robert's been screaming at people all week, but nobody understands the systems you set up." I felt a familiar mix of vindication and sympathy. "What about Janet?" "She's the CFO. Janet's in over her head," Jennifer replied. She's great with routine bookkeeping, but this level of audit trail documentation is beyond her experience. She keeps asking where you documented certain procedures, but nobody knows how to access your files. Of course they couldn't access my files. I'd structured the audit trail using forensic accounting standards that required multiple verification steps and cross-referenced documentation. It wasn't just about organizing information, it was about creating an unbreakable chain of evidence that could withstand legal scrutiny. These weren't skills you could learn from a weekend workshop. By Friday of that week, I heard from 2 different sources that Riverside Medical was threatening to terminate their contract unless TechFlow could provide proper financial documentation within 72 hours. This wasn't just about missing paperwork. Healthcare clients require absolute transparency about how their implementation funds are used, especially when federal compliance is involved. The following Monday brought even worse news. My former colleague Paul called, sounding panicked. "Nicole, they're desperately trying to reach you," he said. "The Martin Healthcare Group audit is due in 3 days, and nobody can figure out your reconciliation process." Martin Healthcare Group was our second largest client, and their quarterly audit was mandated by their board of directors. I'd spent months developing a custom reconciliation process that tracked every expense across multiple cost centers while maintaining the separation required by healthcare regulations. The process was detailed and precise, exactly what was needed for a company handling sensitive healthcare implementations. "What's Robert saying about all this?" I asked. "He's not handling it well," Paul said carefully. "He's been blaming everyone else, saying the team should have been paying better attention to your procedures. But Nicole, nobody understood half of what you were doing. It was too advanced for our normal bookkeeping staff." That was precisely the point. Healthcare implementation auditing isn't normal bookkeeping, it's specialized forensic work that requires understanding regulatory compliance, contract law, and financial investigation techniques. Robert had hired me for exactly these skills, then fired me when I used them to expose his fraud. By Wednesday, the situation had escalated further. Janet, TechFlow CFO, called me directly. "Nicole, I hope you don't mind me reaching out," she said. Her voice strained. "We're having some challenges with the client audits, and I was wondering if you could provide some guidance." This was interesting. Janet had barely spoken to me during my 6 months at TechFlow, dismissing most of my recommendations as unnecessarily complex. Now she was calling for help. "What kind of challenges?" I asked. "Well, we're struggling to recreate some of the documentation standards you established," she admitted. "The clients are asking for verification protocols that, well, we're not sure how to provide." Of course they weren't sure. The verification protocols I'd established were designed to prevent exactly the kind of expense fraud Robert had been perpetrating. They required cross-referencing every payment with multiple independent sources, maintaining segregated documentation for different expense categories, and creating audit trails that could be independently verified. These weren't arbitrary procedures, they were forensic accounting standards designed to detect and prevent financial misconduct. Without them, TechFlow couldn't prove to clients that their money was being handled appropriately. "I'm afraid I can't provide consulting services to TechFlow," I told Janet politely. "Given the circumstances of my departure, it wouldn't be appropriate." "Nicole, please," Janet's voice cracked. "We're really struggling here. Robert he's not being very helpful with resolving these issues." I bet he wasn't being helpful. Robert's help would require admitting that the audit procedures he'd dismissed as paranoid were actually industry standards designed to prevent fraud. It would require acknowledging that his expensive lifestyle was funded by money that should have been allocated to client projects. 2 weeks later, the dam finally burst. My lawyer called with news I'd been expecting. "Nicole, you need to see this," he said, forwarding me a news article from the local business journal. The headline read, "TechFlow Industries loses major clients amid financial documentation issues." The article detailed how both Riverside Medical and Martin Healthcare Group had terminated their contracts with TechFlow, citing inability to provide adequate financial transparency and audit documentation. Combined, these cancellations represented $18 million in annual revenue, more than 20% of TechFlow's total business. But the article also included a quote that made my blood boil. Robert Whitman was quoted saying, "We recently experienced some transitional challenges with our internal audit procedures, but we're confident these temporary issues will be resolved quickly." Temporary issues. As if systematic fraud was just a minor procedural hiccup. That same week, I received a call that changed everything. It was Dr. Patricia Reeves, the Chief Financial Officer of Riverside Medical. "Ms. Martinez, I hope you don't mind me contacting you directly," she said. "I obtained your information from your LinkedIn profile. I wanted to discuss something important." "Of course, Dr. Reeves. How can I help you?" "Well, during our contract termination process with TechFlow, several concerning issues came to light regarding their financial practices," she said carefully. "Issues that go beyond simple documentation problems." My heart rate increased. "What kind of issues?" "Expense allocations that don't match contracted services. Vendor payments that we never authorized. Cost overruns that weren't properly disclosed." She paused. "Ms. Martinez, in your professional opinion, do these sound like simple accounting errors?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for. "Dr. Reeves, based on my experience in forensic accounting, those patterns suggest systematic financial misconduct rather than accounting errors." "That's exactly what I was afraid of," she said. "Ms. Martinez, would you be willing to meet with our legal team? We're considering filing a complaint with the SEC, and we could use someone with your expertise to help us understand what happened to our implementation funds." 3 days later, I sat in a conference room with Riverside Medical's legal team and Dr. Reeves, walking them through the evidence I'd documented during my time at TechFlow. They were horrified by what I showed them, not just the scale of the fraud, but the sophistication of the cover-up. "He was systematically diverting client implementation funds to cover personal expenses," I explained, showing them the cross-referenced documentation. "The expense reports show business entertainment on weekends when no client meetings were scheduled. Vendor payments to companies that provided no services. Travel expenses for locations where TechFlow had no business operations." Dr. Reeves shook her head. "Our implementation was underfunded by nearly $800,000. We assumed it was poor project management, but you're telling us the money was stolen?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," I confirmed. "And Riverside wasn't the only client affected. The fraud was systematic and ongoing." Their lead attorney, Michael Chung, reviewed my documentation carefully. "Ms. Martinez, this evidence is extraordinarily detailed. How were you able to compile such comprehensive records?" "It's my job," I said simply. "When you're conducting forensic auditing, you document everything using multiple verification methods. I maintained encrypted backups of all findings, cross-referenced with independent sources." "And TechFlow fired you after you submitted this report?" Dr. Reeves asked. "They fired me the same day," I confirmed. "The CEO claimed my findings were reckless accusations and that I was undermining the company." Michael Chung smiled for the first time during our meeting. "Ms. Martinez, would you be willing to serve as an expert witness in our SEC complaint? Your documentation could be crucial in proving systematic securities fraud." "Absolutely," I replied. "Investors and clients deserve to know the truth about how their money was handled." That afternoon, Dr. Reeves made me an offer I hadn't expected. "Nicole, Riverside Medical is expanding our internal compliance department," she said. "We need someone with your expertise to oversee financial risk management for our technology implementations. The position would be Director of Financial Compliance, reporting directly to me." I was intrigued. What would the role involve? "Developing and implementing the same kind of rigorous audit procedures you created at TechFlow, but for our internal operations," she explained. "We want to ensure we never experience another situation like this." The salary would be $165,000, plus performance bonuses and equity participation. It was $35,000 more than TechFlow had been paying me, with a much better title and direct reporting to the CFO. More importantly, it was a position where my expertise would be valued rather than dismissed. "Dr. Reeves, I'm very interested," I said. "When would you need an answer?" "Take your time," she smiled. "But Nicole, I want you to know that everyone on our executive team has been impressed by your professionalism throughout this difficult situation. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity we value." As I drove home that evening, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Robert Whitman. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Nicole, thank God you picked up." Robert's voice sounded desperate, nothing like the confident CEO who'd fired me 6 weeks earlier. "I need to talk to you urgently." "What about, Robert?" "Nicole, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding," he said quickly. "Your audit report. I may have reacted too hastily. I was under a lot of pressure, and I didn't give your findings the attention they deserved. I almost laughed. A misunderstanding? Yes, exactly, he said, relief flooding his voice. Look, I know we had some communication issues, but I'd like you to come back. We need your expertise to sort out these client situations. Robert, you fired me for doing exactly what you're now asking me to do. I know, he said frantically. But Nicole, you have to understand the pressure I was under. The board was demanding answers, investors were asking questions. I made some poor decisions. This was fascinating. Robert Whitman, who 6 weeks ago had dismissed my findings as paranoid conspiracy theories, was now admitting he'd made poor decisions. What kind of poor decisions? I asked. There was a long pause. Nicole, I think you and I should meet in person to discuss this. There are some complexities about TechFlow's financial structure that I didn't explain properly. Complexities. That was one way to describe systematic fraud. Robert, I appreciate you calling, but I've already accepted another position. Another position? His voice rose in panic. Nicole, you can't do that. We need you here. I'll double your salary, give you whatever title you want. Chief Financial Officer, if that's what it takes. The irony was incredible. Robert was offering me Janet's job, the same Janet who dismissed my audit procedures as unnecessarily complex. Robert, even if I were interested in returning, there's a problem, I said calmly. What problem? We can work through anything. The SEC investigation, I said simply. The line went silent for nearly 30 seconds. What SEC investigation? He finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. The one that's about to be filed based on the evidence I documented during my 6 months at TechFlow, I explained. The evidence you dismissed as reckless accusations. Nicole, you can't do this, his voice cracked. I'm family. Elena will never forgive you. And there it was, the same misguided assumption that had led him to hire me in the first place. Robert still believed that family connection trumped professional integrity. Robert, you stopped being family the moment you fired me for doing my job ethically, I said. And Elena will understand that I had no choice but to report financial fraud that was harming innocent clients and investors. I hung up and turned off my phone. 3 hours later, Michael Chung called to tell me that TechFlow's stock had dropped 30% in after-hours trading following rumors of an impending SEC investigation. 6 months later, I was settling into my new office at Riverside Medical when Michael Chung called with the final update. Nicole, the SEC settlement was finalized this morning, he said. TechFlow agreed to pay $12 million in penalties and disgorgement. Robert Whitman has been permanently barred from serving as an officer or director of any public company. What about the other executives? I asked. Janet agreed to a 5-year suspension and $200,000 penalty. The board of directors was completely replaced, he paused. The company is essentially defunct. They're selling off assets to pay the settlement. It was a satisfying conclusion, but also sobering. TechFlow had employed over 200 people, most of whom had nothing to do with Robert's fraud. They were casualties of one man's greed and dishonesty. And the whistleblower award? I asked. $1.8 million, Michael smiled. 15% of the total recovery. The SEC was particularly impressed by the quality of your documentation. I thought about that number as I hung up. $1.8 million was exactly my estimate of how much Robert had stolen through his expense fraud scheme. It was poetic justice that his theft was now funding my SEC whistleblower award. But the real victory wasn't financial, it was professional. At Riverside Medical, my expertise was valued and respected. Dr. Reeves regularly consulted me on compliance decisions. My audit procedures were implemented enthusiastically rather than dismissed as paranoid. When I identified potential problems, the executive team thanked me instead of firing me. 3 months ago, our team prevented a potential $3 million fraud scheme by identifying suspicious vendor payments before any money was transferred. Instead of being dismissed as a troublemaker, I was commended for protecting the organization's assets. Instead of being fired, I received a $25,000 performance bonus and a promotion to Senior Director of Financial Compliance. As I look back on my experience at TechFlow, I realized that Robert's biggest mistake wasn't the fraud itself, it was his fundamental misunderstanding of why he'd hired me. He thought my family connection would make me compliant. He assumed I would prioritize personal relationships over professional standards. He never understood that true integrity can't be compromised by personal relationships. A forensic accountant who turns a blind eye to fraud isn't a family-friendly employee, she's an accessory to financial crime. The difference between being needed and being valued became crystal clear through this experience. TechFlow needed my expertise to cover up fraud and maintain the appearance of financial compliance. Riverside Medical values my expertise to prevent fraud and ensure genuine financial integrity. Being needed means you're useful until you become inconvenient. Being valued means your expertise is respected even when it reveals uncomfortable truths. Robert hired me because he thought he could use my skills while controlling my integrity. He learned too late that expertise without ethics is worthless, but ethics without expertise is powerless. I had both, and I wasn't afraid to use them. Today, I work in an environment where rigorous financial oversight is celebrated, not dismissed. Where asking hard questions is seen as protective, not paranoid. Where doing the right thing is valued over keeping the peace. That's the difference between a job and a career, between being an expendable resource and being an essential professional. True success isn't about being the person others want you to be. It's about being the person your expertise and integrity demand you to be, regardless of who finds that inconvenient. Some people might call me a whistleblower. I prefer to think of myself as a professional who refused to let family loyalty compromise financial integrity. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to prevent them from destroying themselves through their own bad choices. Robert could have had a successful, ethical company if he'd valued the expertise he hired instead of trying to corrupt it. Instead, he has a lifetime ban from corporate leadership and a legacy of fraud. That wasn't my choice, it was his. I just made sure the truth came to light before more people got hurt.